Hi everyone, welcome back. In the last few videos I've talked about how to ensure that we don't have bugs in production with tools like PHPUnit and PHPStan. Basically ensuring that all the code that ends up in production is of quality. But there still will be some errors or exceptions that do end up in production. And we want to make sure that we know about them and that our user doesn't get an ugly error page. And before we continue, it's important to distinguish between what an exception and an error is. Because if something happens during the execution of our code that's unexpected, there's two things that can happen. An exception can be thrown or an error can be triggered. And when an error is triggered, execution will just continue afterwards. But with an exception, that will stop unless we catch the error. And as you can see, the documentation for errors is quite empty. And that's because starting from PHP 7, most errors have actually been converted to exceptions. And things get a bit more complicated with that, because now some errors are throwables and some other errors are still reported through the traditional error reporting mechanism. So let's first start with that. And if you've been following the previous videos, it's not really necessary, but it's nice to see that we've ended up here. We have a controller. I added a new HTML response here, and we get back the hello world. So we'll use this controller for testing. Now there are not a lot of functions left in PHP that still trigger errors that end up in the traditional error reporting. But one of them that is still there is file get contents, when there's a call to a file that doesn't exist. So I'll type something random here, and if I now open this page, we do get a warning. But to get access to these errors, we can do a set error handler with a static function with some parameters. Already have these on my clipboard because they're long to type out. And then we can do an echo, for example. Let's do 1, 2, 3, so we can actually see that we end up in the error handler. And now we get an unable to emit response because we did send already an echo here. So if we don't do anything here, our hello world appears again. So because we now have an explicit error handler instead of the internal one from PHP, we now say, okay, we don't do anything with it. But we actually want to do something with this. But before we handle these errors and log them somewhere useful, we should really think about where we should put this code. Because right now it lives in this invoke method, and this is not the place, especially because we're calling a global function. But even if it weren't a global function, this would only apply for the errors below this set error handler. So we want to move this to somewhere before any other code is executed. And if you've seen the routing video, you might remember that we have set up our Nginx to route all requests through the index.php, which lives in our public folder. And here it loads the autoloads from Composer, and then we load all our routes, which lives in the config folder. And then we basically handle with the router the request. And because there might be issues in our Composer autoload file, we basically want to start reporting before this. But then if we want to also have the same error reporting and exception handler for PHPUnit, we now directly include the vendor autoload, but we also might want to use the logic we have here. So now it's time to split this up. And as we want to load the autoloader and also set error handler at one place, we need to figure out a file for that. And what's the common practice is to create a bootstrap file. And this usually either lives in the root of the project or in the public folder, but then it's also included from test or from PHPUnit, so I just prefer it to live in the root of the project. And we can also later on use this to execute commands. So as usual, we add a declare strict types, and then we do an include of our vendor autoloads file. And then in our index file, instead of doing a vendor autoload include, we do a bootstrap include. So from now on, whenever a request gets routed to the index.php file, we first require the bootstrap file, and then we should also require the autoload file, and things still work the same. But now we do have a central point where we can change things. And in fact, we can even tell PHPUnit with the bootstrap directive currently set to vendor autoload to now use a proper bootstrap file. Is at bootstrap.php. And now we can finally move our set error handler to this bootstrap file. And if we move to our browser, you can still see that that still works. And usually in error and exception handlers, you want to do one of two things. You want to display it to developers, or you want to hide it for users, but still send them to a place where you can see them. So sometimes this is done with logs. There's tools like Sentry where you can send these to. But we need to know if we are in a production or in a test or development environment. And we can set the environment with environment variables. And let's call the environment variable env, because otherwise it will collide with environment. And let's set this to dev here, and also in our example file, because the next developer might also need it. And let's also set it in PHPUnit. So in PHPUnit, it's going to be test. So we set a directive env. We set the name to env and the value to test. And then to retrieve it, we need to set an environment key, also env. And now we can retrieve the container. So we can do a kernel get container. There we get the environment class. And from the environment class, we get the string environment key env. And let's assign this to the variable env. But if this causes any exceptions, then our exception handler, which we don't have, will be called. So it gets quite complicated. So let's do a try catch around this. And if we have any throwables, then we will assign env to null. So let's start with formatting the error as a nice string. Let's do a sprintf of the error codes, the file name, the line number, error string, error number, file line. And depending on the environment, so if we are one of the environments where we actually want to show the error, in this case will be dev and test. And let's set the third parameter here for type safety. Then we want to echo the formatted error, and otherwise we want to log this. So we do a file, put contents on error.log formatted error. And let's add a new line. They are legible, and we want to make sure that we do a file append. And then we can check if this actually works, because right now we do get the error here. We also still get the error related to the headers already being sent, but we'll ignore that for now. But if we now go to our env file, and instead of dev, we set it to prod, we now, the path is not correct. Should be there. Error. And now you can see that it wrote to this file. And if we do a bunch more refreshes, we get a bunch more errors in here. And let's close the log file and switch back to development. Now, up until now, we only handled errors. But if we throw an exception here and we don't catch it, or we don't catch it anywhere up till the index.php, then in the current form, it will not end up in this error handler, because it's not an error, it's an exception. So we want to do the same thing with that exception handler. But the code in here is not really usable right now. So let's change that first. So let's create an exception handler. And types. And then we have two public static functions. We have handle error, and we have handle exception. And let's move the code from the current error handler to this handle error method. And then in here we do an exception handler, handle error with error number, error string, error file, error line. And let's clean up these two statements. And then we also need to pass these along. So in the handle error, we need to accept these as arguments. And in this exception handler, we can also add a static function. But instead of a bunch of parameters, we only get throwable e. And we can call the exception handler, handle exception with that e. Accept it here. And now try to reuse some of the logic above. So there's multiple things we do in here. We check if we should display the errors, and then we either echo it or log it to a file. So first let's make a method to check if we should display errors. So we do display errors, which will return a boolean. And basically we need this part. So we need the environment, retrival, and then we return the in array of the dev test. Set true. So we can refactor this to self display errors. Then we do a formatted display. Otherwise, we do a file put contents. And we can also abstract that. So we can do a log error void. And then we put in the file put contents of the formatted error, which we need to pass along. And then we do a self log error of the formatted error. And now we can do the same with the handle exception. So we copy this piece of code. And instead of a formatted error, this is a formatted exception. And we need to pass these. We have a get message, get code, get file, get line. And if we now go to our browser, we actually get the formatted exception here. Now we've handled errors and exception, but there's one more scenario which we haven't touched, and that's if we run out of memory. So if we do a string repeat of the letter X, let's do it 1 billion times, so we know for sure we run out of memory. If I now go to my browser, I still get the fatal error, and you can see the way this is formatted, this is not coming through our exception or error handlers. But we can also handle this scenario. We need to do a register shutdown function, pass a static function again, without any arguments this time. And if we do an error get lost, it will return an array if there was any error, and otherwise it will return null. So let's move this to exception handler method, handle shutdown. Last error is error get lost. If last error is null, then we return. And otherwise, we want to do the same check again. So if we display the errors, we want to display it, and otherwise we want to log it. And the formatted exception in this case should be formatted error. Should be another printf. And our last error has some array keys. So it should be message, file, line, and type. Line. If we go back to our browser, we now still have the fatal error, but we also got our own logged error. And let's slightly clean this up. So we add a return type, and let's group this with the other public methods. So here. And this is a unique case because in the shutdown, we already ran out of memory. But if we now want to log to external services, we don't have any memory left to actually do that. So what multiple frameworks do is register a bit of memory so we can actually handle also out of memory issues. And to do that, we can add a static property. So we're going to do private static of reserved memory. And that's going to be either a string or null. And then we can add a public static function initialize. And then in here we can do a self reserved memory is a string repeat of letter X again, but in this case only 10,000. And right now this is an invalid state. So we have registered the error handler and the shutdown handler and exception handler, but we haven't called the initialize function. So let's mark these as private. And make sure that there's only one method that you can call, and that will make sure that the entire state is set correctly. So we remove all of these and move them to the initialize method. And then in here we need to call exception handler initialize. And then to unreserve this memory, we can go to the handle shutdown function, and then we can do a self reserved memory is null. And now we do have some extra memory to work with. But if we now switch to our browser, there's a new error because now I can't find the exception handler anymore. And that's because previously we didn't really execute these callbacks yet, and only after the autoload was loaded we executed these. But now it immediately needs to know where this exception handler lives. Now there are two things we can do here. We could move this initialize call till after the autoload file has been required. But if something happens here during the loading of this file, or the file doesn't exist, we won't know about it because our exception handler hasn't been initialized. So instead we want to make sure that this actually happens first, but we want to tell this PHP script where our exception handler lives. And we can actually do that manually by doing a require of the source exception handler. And now if we refresh our page, we're back with our allowed memory size exceeded. Now this video was a bit longer than my usual format. I hope you appreciate it. And if you want to make sure that you are updated when the next video comes out, please make sure to subscribe. And I'll hopefully see you in the next one.